Okay, get started then. Hello, my name is London Pinkney, and I'll be the moderator for today's conversation. Today I'll be speaking to Joe Cassara and Tanya M. Foster. They are the George and Judy Marcus Endowed Chairs for the Creative Writing Department. Joseph Cassara is the author of the critically acclaimed novel, The House of Impossible Beauties, which won numerous awards, including but not limited to the Edmund White Award for Debut Fiction, 2 International Latino Book Awards, and the National Arts and Entertainment Journalism Award for New Fiction. Foster is the author of A Swarm of Bees in High Court and the bilingual chapbook La Grammaire des Os, the chapbook A History of the Bitch, and the co-editor of Third Mind, Creative Writing Through Visual Art. Her writing and research focuses on ideas of place and emplacement and on the intersections between the visual and written. Her next poetry collection, Thingification, is forthcoming from Ugly Press in 2021. Monkey Talk, a cross-genre series about race, paranoia, aesthetics, and surveillance, is in development with support from a 2020 Creative Capital Foundation grant. Dr. Foster is a poetry editor at Fence Magazine, a recipient of awards and fellowships from the Ford and the Mellon Foundations, from New York Foundation of the Arts. She has been an artist in residence at the San Francisco Museum of the African Diaspora and the Headland Center of the Arts, and at McDowell's, a 2020-2021 Lisa Goldberg Fellow, and at the Radcliffe Institution of Harvard University. I'm so happy to be speaking to both of you.
Happy speaking to you.
Thank you.
Happy to be here, London.
Thank you guys so much. I know that Tanya's book, A Swarm of Bees in High Castle, has been described as a biography of place. So I'd like to start by asking both of you, how did where you grew up influence your work?
I'll start, if that's okay. I think for me, I grew up in New Orleans, and there's something that Italo Calvino writes in Invisible Cities, where Marco Polo discusses the idea that Venice is implicit in all his descriptions of place, of locations, of all these other locations he encounters. And I feel like New Orleans is that city for me. It's that home that's always a kind of touchstone, whether or not I know it. It's how I've come to understand place and home and belonging. So in that way, I wrote A Swarm of Bees in High Court by listening in Harlem, by a very close kind of listening.
I grew up in New Jersey, about an hour outside of New York City. So both of my parents grew up in New York, so all of my extended family was in the city, in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Staten Island. And I think that in my prose, I'm really interested in voice-driven narratives. And if I look back on my childhood, growing up in a place as diverse as New Jersey out of the city, listening to Spanish being spoken and Spanglish spoken on my mother's side of the family, Puerto Rican side of the family, and then hearing Sicilian dialect and Italian being spoken on my father's side of the family, and just how I learned to appreciate the nature of language, especially when there were multiple languages being fused at once. It was very playful in a linguistic way, and that's what I grew up thinking of as the norm for language. And I think when I look back on my development as a writer, that was incredibly influential on me.
So amazing. And speaking of childhood, what writers influenced you too as you grew up?
Tanya, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
I'm open to, do you want to go first?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I think the first writer that I read that made me really love language was Carson McCullers' The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, which I read in middle school. And and also The Wall by John Hersey, which I read in the seventh grade, which is this super long book. I think John Hersey is more famous for his book Hiroshima, but The Wall is about life inside the Warsaw Ghetto, and it follows about 45 characters during World War II. And it was the first time that I had read something of that scope. Um, and so, in terms of like character, Carson McCullers. In terms of scope, I would say John Hersey. Those are the two that immediately come to mind. There's many others, but those are the first two that come to mind.
Right. It's hard for me to pull up two, except I think that I was, um, as a kid, I used to dream about changing my name so that my books could be on the shelf next to Nabokov. Um, I also, I mean, of course, a big fan of Rita Dove, um, of Yusef Komunyakaa, who actually visited my high school um, to to hold a poetry class. Um, I loved Philip K. Dick. I mean, I have a host, oddly, of fiction writers who were my um, teachers in some way. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I can definitely see the writers who inspired you in both of your works because Joe, your work's definitely like polyphonic and there's so many characters in there. And I feel like Nabokov's language is so precise. I have a love of him too, so I definitely feel you there with wanting to change your name. Just so you guys know, I'm going to sort of like go back and forth when it comes to my questions, and it'll be based on a swarm of bees in high court, and the House of Impossible Beauty. So to start with you, Tanya, you're from New Orleans, but this book is so set in Harlem. What made you choose Harlem as a place to explore?
Well, it's interesting. I was living in Harlem, and I lived there for a long time, for almost 20 years. And I have to say, I also lived in Boston for a while and outside of Boston. And um, of all the cities I've lived in the country, Harlem inside of New York reminded me most of New Orleans. And so there was something um, I wanted to get at. Like, I lived across from a basketball court. And so in the middle of the night, there would be somebody out there doing layups. And so you'd hear that ball bouncing. You'd also hear so many different kinds of conversations going on. Um, there's a real sense of who's been there a long time, who's new to the place, people saying hello from down the block, people on the corner gathering, there being a party. And so something about that life um, seemed particularly important and vibrant to me. Um, and I think I'm just interested in the way that places train, where we are trains our tongues, right? Wherever we are. Um, that we learn to speak in particular cadences. We learn to speak in certain rhythms because we're walking up hills or, you know, on flatlands or it's muggy out. Um, and so that was at the time what really interested me. Also, I think Harlem has there's there's a lot of grief and a lot of joy mixed up. Um, and so, what are the ways that we register that grief and joy? I just wanted to pay attention to.
Thank you.
Tanya, I really love what you say about like how the places where we live influence the type of language that we're speaking or how we express ourselves. And um, it made me think of this video from Dr. I think his name is Silverstein. He taught at the University of Chicago, and he did this public lecture at in Chicago, I think, for like a humanities festival. It's called America's Tongues, and it's all about linguistic differences in the different regions of the states. And he plays all of these clips, and he shows things from movies and oral history clips of people talking. There's someone from Alabama, there's someone from the suburbs of Chicago, and there's someone from New York. And I assigned it this semester for my seminar on voice to like start thinking about how we have the same toolbox of words, but we play with it in ways that are really intuitive, that are influenced by what we hear when we grow up or where we're living. And so it made me think that.
I would love to see that video. I mean, I joke, I once fell in love with a man because he sounded like somebody from New Orleans. And that there was something in the cadence of his voice that felt incredibly familiar and comforting. So I believe it has tremendous influence on how we can think a thought, right? The shape of a thought. And I think of rap music, that the same words, and yet there are different styles of rap precisely because there's an emphasis on the accent.
Thank you so much. Joe, what led you to writing about the House of Extravaganza?
I would say I was really inspired by the documentary Paris is Burning. And when I started writing the novel, I didn't think that I was writing a novel. I thought I was just going to write a short story that somehow incorporated the house in a way by writing about certain members. And then it just kind of grew. And once I was maybe 50 pages in, I realized that the scope of the story was much broader than I had originally anticipated, and then it was becoming a novel. So I don't know. It's easier to think of these things in terms of like retrospectively looking back. I can say like I was super inspired by Paris is Burning. I'm really interested in like queer Nuyorican life in the 80s and 90s in New York, the sounds of the language at the time, the sounds of the city at the time, the fashion. Like these are all things that I look back on the novel and I think, oh, it makes sense that I had written this because these are the things that I'm interested in. These are the kind of themes that I was preoccupied with during the years that I was writing it. But when I first started it, as with any project that I'm starting, I don't know if I necessarily know why I'm going into it. I just take a step back and just kind of write scenes that I'm interested in, see how they develop, and then it's only afterwards that I look back and I think, oh, that's interesting. I must have been preoccupied with this certain theme for like a few months and it made its way into the narrative.
Wow. How long did it take you to write, to map out? I'm sorry. How long did it take you to map out the?
It took me 2 years, which I think it would have taken longer had I not been in graduate school when I was working on it, because I think the benefit of the program at the time was that it gave me the time and space to really just focus on the book. But I think if I had been juggling other things in my life, it would have taken me probably twice the amount of time.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Is that something that's common for you both? Do you get focused on an idea and then the creation process sort of happens, or is it more linear?
For me, it varies. I mean, I feel like with Swarm, I've been asked to write about. Swarm was written over a very long period of time, but it was sort of written in the margins of a life that was very busy. I mean, I must have had, one full-time job and 2 or 3 part-time jobs, and so back in 2001, I was asked to. I was part of organizing something post 9/11, and was asked to write something, and that just struck me as odd. Um, and I thought, what can I possibly write about this? This is horrible. There's not much to say other than this is horrible. And a friend said I had been writing these haiku to a man I liked a lot. And a friend said, why don't you write haiku about it? And the idea of a certain kind of loss. And I was paying attention to um, the stunning silence, the stunning quiet, I should say, not silence, the stunning quiet in Harlem on the days immediately after. That struck me as a point of shock. And so I would walk down the street and I'd be composing these small verses and then collected a lot of them and um, stuck to the idea of the form, and then the content sort of expressed itself through that form. Yeah.
For me, I would say that I generally start with character, or I either see the character in a scene, or I think of a line of dialogue that they say, and I just kind of follow them in the scene, and then that leads to another scene. And when I'm writing, I don't necessarily think of these scenes as being incorporated into the novel. I just write the scenes as an act of discovery, and I know that later in the revision process, I'll decide which makes the most sense to be included in the story and which I needed to write in order to understand everything, but which is not really, which it doesn't need to be included in the book.
I love that description, Joseph. I mean, I feel like the writing for me is also a point of discovery. I don't know before I write what it will be. I may know something about the form. I may know something about some impulse or a faint notion of an idea, but the particularities of its expression comes to me in the act of writing.
I know so many students who feel like they're always discovering, but they don't know when like a work is complete, whether it's because like we're our worst enemies and we're always tinkering away at something, or just you keep learning new things about a work. How do you guys know when like the work is complete and you're done having that creative discovery?
I would say when I can't bear to look at it anymore.
It's different for me. I mean, I feel like I can say, okay, I'm just going to send this off now because it's time. There's a deadline and I've got to let it go. But there are versions of A Swarm of Bees where I've written in the margins. different verses and new verses. And if I lose those books, then I've lost those verses. But that there's some part of the project that still is alive for me. But I mean, who said we abandon things? You know, they're sort of the abandoned children where we're like, okay, see ya, on to the next thing. And maybe you come back, and maybe it's an issue you revisit in some way or revisit in some new way. But yeah.
I think also when you spend so much time with one project that has connected themes, these are things that really interest you for a certain period of time. And obviously later on in your career or with another project, you're going to revisit these themes because they're so central to what you think about all the time and what you care about. But I know for me, like The House of Impossible Beauties, I was wrapped up in the 80s and the 90s. And now the book that I'm working on takes place in the early part of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And they feel like they take up completely different parts of my brain and heart. Whereas I can open up The House of Impossible Beauties and there will be things that I want to edit in terms of like the line, but I no longer feel like I'm in that world in the way that I was when I was writing it. Like time has passed and I've moved on to some new themes. And I noticed that there are similarities between the book that I'm working on and the themes that are in my first book. But I also recognize that I'm looking at them maybe from different angles, or I'm experimenting with new ways of playing with voice, or I want to push the structure, the form of the novel in a way that had not even occurred to me when I was working on my first book. And so I think when I think about students who wonder when a piece is done, if you put that story in a drawer and you come back to it a few months later and you want to keep on working on it, then it's not done yet. But if you put it away in storage and you come back to it and you're just not feeling the same kind of excitement that you did when you were writing it, that might be a sign that like you worked out all of the things that you wanted to work out with that piece. You know, all the things that were kind of swimming around in the subconscious mind, like you made those connections and you've made your peace with it and you've let it out. And so then maybe then it's done.
Thank you. That's really helpful, both of you. I have some student questions here. The first question is by Trayvon Malik Roach Carter, and he asks, if your writing were a genre of music, what genre would it be?
Ooh.
Sometimes jazz, but sometimes Nina Simone, which bridges jazz and other kinds of music, and sometimes D'Angelo, so old school neo soul R&B. Yeah, sometimes.
I would say for The House of Impossible Beauties, definitely like freestyle in the 80s, New York or Chicago style freestyle music. I wouldn't say the same for the book that I'm working on now, though.
What would you say for the book you're working on now?
I'm not sure, you know, like, so the book I'm working on now is early 20th century about an American painter. It doesn't take place in New York. There's no Spanglish. It's, you know, the form, it's still, the narrator still kind of has its own energy to it. Like the narratorial presence is voice driven and self-reflexive and sometimes funny. But I'm playing with language in a different way than I did in Impossible Beauties. And so I feel like if I have to think of it in terms of like the musicality of it, it doesn't feel like freestyle. I'm not sure what genre of music I would say though.
Mm. Okay. Vanessa Hamill would like to know, do you have an internal rule while selecting works for your syllabus?
Yes, I do. Does she want to know the rule? Does she want to know that I have the rule? I do. I'm committed to work that raises questions for me.
I'm not sure if I have a single rule, but I think of the syllabus like there's two goals I think when I create a syllabus. I either want the course or the course readings to pose a question collectively to the students, like a semester long question for them to think about, or I want the progression of the material to kind of tell its own kind of story. And so I definitely think about how I'm curating the reading list in terms of themes, and I'm also thinking about the authors that are on the list too. I always think about my first year as a TA in grad school. I taught this class called Interpretation of Literature, and that was the fall that Michael Brown had been killed. And so we had a conversation in class about, I was just curious. I wanted to know how many students had been assigned an author of color in their English classes in high school. And only 2 students had. And both of those students were from the suburbs of Chicago. One student had been assigned Toni Morrison, and the other student had been assigned Chinua Achebe. And all the other students, this was in Iowa City, all the other students who were from Iowa, growing up in mostly white towns, had never even been assigned a writer of color. And then I thought back to when I was in high school, like, who were the writers of color that I had been assigned? And the only one I could think of was Sandra Cisneros, The House on Mango Street. And so when I'm creating a syllabus, I am aware of that. And I realize that like there's work to be done in college level syllabi to make up for the lack of diversity that high school students across the entire country are experiencing.
See, I start from the I start from a different space where my thought is, I remember once a student said to me, "They're all people of color on your reading list." I'm like, "Oh, really? I hadn't noticed." And so the starting point for me is a narrative of literature that is already deeply diverse. Yeah.
I don't know, I haven't seen your guys' syllabuses yet or syllabi, but have you had students react one way or another when there are a lot of writers of color on your list?
How have students reacted? Usually we're reading such great work, we get into the work, which is what it's there for. And it's for me, it's not even a question of making up for what they haven't gotten. It's showing them, engaging them with the world as it is. And with literature that's engaged by the world as it is. Yeah.
My experience teaching in California, I haven't received any negative feedback, but in grad school I did. Yeah, the anonymous teaching evaluations, one said that one complained that there were no white men on the syllabus, which is an interesting complaint. And then the other complaint was that there were too many LGBT themed things and that I was quote unquote pushing my lifestyle on them. And so I thought like, oh my God, how many? It's like, did I really include that many? And I looked back and there were three. And what's fascinating also about the three was that one was the autobiography of Red by Anne Carson, which is technically about a gay dragon. So I don't, written by a straight woman, right?
Yeah.
And then the other story was Brokeback Mountain, again, a straight woman who wrote that. And then the other was David Sedaris. I had included an essay. So it was like, I mean, I guess LGBT themes, but really only one gay writer. So I knew that teaching evaluation was not accurate, but they still said what they said, and I had to grapple with that afterwards.
Well, and somehow the administration should grapple with that, right? That the administrations have to look at the student evaluations and question the biases of its students rather than just say, well, bring on more white men.
That's so amazing. Speaking of administration, Zach Russi would like to know, were you not constricted by department regulations and requirements? What type of class would you like to teach?
And how, if I were not constricted?
Yeah, if you were not, if you could just, impressionable minds at your disposal.
Wow. I would actually like to teach a class that allowed in people from the community, and a class that, I mean, it would depend. I'm interested in a workshop that's not necessarily set up in a class format, but that takes place someplace else. What is it to be a writer in the world? We spend a lot of time at museums, some barber shops, hair salons, taking oral histories. We'd read a lot of theory because there are some people doing some incredibly interesting work in theory that is actually changing what we think of as critical writing. I think that we'd have cross-disciplinary workshops so that people are writing poetry and nonfiction and fiction. Yeah. And talking to each other across genre.
I think what I've observed so far is that the way the department kind of titles the courses, they're titled in a way that each instructor will really bring something different to it. Like the course I'm teaching, the undergrad seminar I'm teaching this semester is titled Investigating Voice. And I think that I would teach that class differently than someone else, right? It's the beauty of just the phrasing of investigating voice. Like, do you focus on the investigation aspect of it? Do you investigate the voice aspect of it? What does voice mean to different instructors? And so what I appreciate is that we kind of do have the freedom to bring the material that we want to bring to the classroom. If there were no administrative restraints, I think that I would love to teach like a large lecture style class. I think, especially in creative writing, typically our courses are small seminars based on discussion. And I love that, but I've never had the opportunity to teach like a large lecture style class. I'm not sure how I would go about it. It just feels like it would feel like a different challenge. because it wouldn't be as discussion based. It would just be like presentation of different material. And that in a way seems exciting to me. I think because it's like a situation where, it's something that I've never done before that I'm curious about.
Nice.
When you first became educators, was there a certain book that you were excited to teach?
First became. I remember teaching Invisible Man. And what was exciting for me is the sort of different modes in that book. And so saying, okay, we're going to read Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And and so doing all of these kinds of connections with the book and things to read, that was exciting for me.
I don't know if I have one particular book that I really looked forward to. I tend to like assign things that are really new. Like this semester in my grad workshop, we just read The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, which came out a few months ago. I'm always interested. I'm always looking out for like what are the books that are coming out this year? What can I assign? I want my students to engage with contemporary fiction and the conversations that we are having as writers right now in the world of literary fiction, or the world of creative nonfiction. What conversations are we having? And so I'm just always looking out the landscape to see what are the books of the moment, and that's what excites me.
Thank you. I'm always so interested in the way professors balance out reading older books and more contemporary work. Tanya, where do you stand on that?
Well, it's interesting. My last poetry workshop, we read Shelley's In Defense of Poetry, which is very old. We also read Dennis Smith's Homie. So that my interest in the poetry workshop was in saying, okay, let's do some reading in the field of poetics. Let's do a kind of excavation of what is considered the kind of grounding tenets or concerns of poetry in English, and discuss what that means for contemporary, or when we look at contemporary concerns and issues. So I often try to do a balance, a real mix of things. So definitely a lot of poets who are writing now, and books that have just come out, but also older work.
And my last student question I have is from Lorraine Mays Hardy. And she asks, how have you maintained creativity during this time of collective grief?
It's tough.
Mm.
I find that some days or even some weeks, it's so tough that it's impossible. It feels like so crippling. And then there are other weeks where I want to like lose myself in the work. Like I just want to just delve so far into the fictional realm that I don't have to think about what's happening in the world around me for a few hours. It's like a form of escape, but it's tough. But I also think that like if we look back in history, there have been periods that have been very hard for humanity, and there have been beautiful works that have come out of like war-torn areas. That creativity and the struggle around us don't have to be completely separate things. Like we can still be creative people who turn to art even when the world feels like it is very, very difficult.
I mean, I think that the creative world is where we practice what we do in the day to day. And that I think that certainly during this time, I feel like I found other things I've had to become creative about, whether it's how to have a sense of community when I'm in isolation, right? And certainly we all become familiar with Zoom and Google Meets and all the various those things. And so it's how to have a cocktail hour with my friends on Zoom. That has been a way of refusing the isolation, the kind of radical individualism that's foisted on us to honestly keep us from um, the kind of, I don't know, radical social intervention that we might make together. And so, how to do that anyway, how to have community anyway, that has been my focus. In terms of my creative work, I've let myself grieve when I have to. Um, and sometimes that means, um, you know, not writing a poem every day. Sometimes that means just talking to my family or talking to my friends or going for a walk or sitting on the beach. Um, yeah, I mean, joy is the sanest form of resistance right now. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I've answered your question.
Feels unanswerable, but I think you both did a great job. Those are all the questions that I have for you guys. Thank you for speaking with me today.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you,
the
London.
questions.